Many of you have seen our distinguished guest today on her very popular TED Talk. As a matter of fact, I think her TED Talk has to be one of the most downloaded, one of the most viewed ones of all of last year, if not in the history of TED Talks. Well over 1 million hits for Annie Murphy Paul's TED Talk. I first heard her TED Talk on NPR. It was a discussion that they were having on a show, and as soon as we heard the content of the 18-minute TED Talk, we knew that we had to get her here on campus. Ms. Paul is a graduate from Yale, but her husband is actually a professor at Yale, and she on occasion continues to teach there. She is an author. She is a consultant. She is a blogger. She blogs weekly for Time.com, for CNN.com weekly. She blogs for the Oprah Magazine website. She blogs for Forbes.com. She is a senior editor with Psychology Today. And so what we have today is just a lady who's going to bring before you her TED Talk, which I think is going to be not only invigorating for other conversations later on today at lunch for you, but something that I think is going to be really, I think, empowering for those of us in this room who, as Christians, really love this idea of helping moms. And even as we talk about Bridges Out of Poverty, and we look at how that offering today will help a single mom out who right now maybe has a baby in the belly. And we want to come alongside of someone like that and help them in that stage of life, all the way down to whole life issues. But man, we're just honored to have her. I know that you're going to look back on this day and say she was one of our favorite Convo speakers. Can we just welcome to the house Miss Annie Murphy Paul? Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, David, very much, and thank you all for coming out to listen this morning. As David said, I'm a researcher. I'm a journalist who writes about social science research. But I often think of what I do as something more like me-search, because I end up writing about things that are really personally relevant and important to me. And that was the case when I wrote a book called Origins, which is about what goes on in the 9 months before birth. And I reported and researched and wrote that book while I was pregnant with the first of my 2 sons, which seemed like a great idea at the time. The problem was that when I was trying to finish up the book, I had a newborn. You know, I then went on to have another baby, and guess what? Babies grow up and they go to school. So then I found myself writing about learning and education and how it was that children grow and learn. So I moved on from fetal development to learning, but there's actually a really interesting place where those 2 things intersect. You know, when we think about learning, we often think about a school setting, but of course we start learning a lot sooner than kindergarten or first grade. We start learning as toddlers. We start learning to walk and to talk. As infants, we're learning to roll over and, you know, sit up and whatever it is that babies learn to do. But learning starts even before that, in the womb. And so my TED Talk, I think now I've gotten my slides out of order. I'd show that slide of my next book. Brilliant. Yeah, so that's the next book that I'm writing. It'll be out next year, and that's about learning. But my TED Talk combined these 2 interests of mine, learning and fetal development, asking, when does learning begin? And learning begins before birth. Now, when I gave that TED Talk, and you can show that picture of me at the TED Talk, it wasn't to an audience nearly this big. But I can tell you that the toughest audience that I ever faced was a bunch of middle schoolers. So you all are much better behaved than that. So I'm going to retrace some of the material that I covered in my TED Talk, which some of you may have seen today. But I also want to update that 2011 talk with some really exciting new research that's come out just in the last 3 or 4 years. And that research is demonstrating that learning begins even earlier than scientists realize. And we now have evidence that the learning that goes on in the womb, that causes the fetal brain to grow. Now we have evidence that all that learning that goes on is actually growing the fetus's brain. It's a really exciting time in this area of research. So if wonderful Liberty University tech people, if you could just roll some of those 3D images now, that would be great. You know, when I had my first son, I just had the regular ultrasound, which is this kind of fuzzy black and white image. When I was pregnant with my second son, the technology had improved to the point where I had this 3D image of my second son while he was still in the womb, and it was just amazing. He looked just like he did when I met him for the first time in the delivery room. So these pictures are really kind of incredible. So, learning that starts before birth. Yeah, it's a happy one. Fetuses can start to smell and taste around 20 weeks of gestation. So, everything that a woman eats, the flavors and the tastes of the food that she eats, they go into the amniotic fluid that surrounds the fetus. And the fetus is smelling and swallowing and tasting that continuously. So if you think about that, a lot of our culture is really packed into the food that we eat. Its characteristic spices and flavors and tastes. And so even when fetuses are still in the womb, they're becoming members of that particular culture, that community that they're going to join soon by getting to know the kind of food that that community eats. And there's evidence that babies remember and prefer the taste that they've encountered before in the womb. In one experiment, a group of pregnant women was asked to drink a lot of carrot juice during pregnancy. Not something they normally would do, but as part of the experiment, they drank a lot of carrot juice. Another group of pregnant women was the control group. They did not drink carrot juice. Then babies are born. Once they start eating solid food, some babies, the babies are given baby food, like this rice cereal that when you have kids, you'll learn about all this stuff, this rice cereal that babies eat. Mixed it with carrot juice. The babies who had not the babies whose mothers had not drunk carrot juice during their pregnancy, they made faces, they didn't like it, they'd never had this before. The babies whose mothers had drank a lot of carrot juice during pregnancy, they smiled, like that baby we saw out there. They knew that taste, they'd had that before, they remembered it from when they were in the womb. Now, fetuses can start to hear at around 25 weeks of gestation. And from that point on, they're listening raptly to the sound of their mother's voice, which is actually conducted and amplified by the woman's body. So they're continually hearing everything that their mother says. Scientists have used this fact that fetuses can hear to see what exactly it is that fetuses can learn while they're in the womb. And they have had pregnant women read a nursery rhyme or sing a song like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, kind of to their bellies, repeatedly while they're pregnant. And then after the babies are born, the babies get wired up with this it's a non-invasive technology called EEG, where there's a cap of little sensors are placed on the baby's head. And these sensors measure electrical activity in the baby's brain. And scientists can tell that when you play that song again or recite that nursery rhyme again, the baby's brain just lights up. It remembers having heard that in the womb. If you read to them an unfamiliar nursery rhyme, nothing much happens. And this is the case even 4 months after a baby is born. This testing of the electrical activity in the baby's brain happens right after birth, and they remember that song or that rhyme. But then 4 months later, think of all that happens in the first 4 months of a baby's life, but they still react strongly to that nursery rhyme or that song that they heard in the womb. They remember it 4 months later. Now we know that fetuses, this is one of the more recent experiments that has been carried out since my TED Talk. We now know that fetuses can recognize and remember particular words that they heard when they were in the womb. And again, scientists came up with this kind of ingenious way to test that. They made up a nonsense word like ta-ta-ta that normally, no one would ever say and no fetus would ever hear. But the pregnant women in the experimental group would say this nonsense word to their fetuses several times a day. And sometimes they would vary it. Sometimes they would say ta-ta-ta, and other times they would say ta-ta-ta. They would vary it in very, very subtle ways, really, these little building blocks of language that are the way that we begin to learn how to understand language and how to speak it. And then, again, the babies are born, they get the EEG cap on, and the babies are able to recognize that nonsense word and even distinguish those tiny little differences and stresses, the different pronunciations. They are listening and remembering in the womb what they hear. Now, in fact, there's even, to me, amazing research that suggests that babies are learning the accent of their native language while they're still in the womb. You can see how this is setting things up so the baby is ready to learn language as soon as they come out of the womb, because before they're even born, they're hearing their mother speak, and they're picking up on the particular accent of the native language that this baby will eventually speak. And so from the moment of birth, scientists have discovered, babies cry in the accent of their mother's native tongue. So that French babies immediately upon birth cry with a rising note, and German babies cry with the sound of their cry goes down, which is imitating the sort of melodic contours of those languages. So a baby is French as soon as they're born, a baby is German, a baby is American, in this really amazing way. Now, if you think about this, this is very adaptive. This is a really great idea for babies to be already getting a head start on language before they're born, and even making sounds that are recognizably familiar to the mother. This might have kind of helped ensure a baby's survival. The baby is more responsive to her mother's voice than to other voices from the moment of birth. The baby makes sounds that sound like a familiar sound as soon as they're born. This is a way that babies are already becoming a part of their community. We often think when a baby's born that they're somehow brand new to the world. But in fact, the world, the specific world that they are going to enter, has been shaping them for 9 months. And towards the end of pregnancy, when the fetus is more developed, that fetus is not only being shaped by those influences, but is also actively responding to and learning from and remembering those influences. And as we've seen, this gives babies a head start on all the things they're going to have to learn as infants and as children. So the baby emerges already familiar with the diet of its culture. The baby emerges already knowing and responding to its mother's voice. The baby emerges knowing the rhythm and the cadence of its mother's language and recognizing certain words and rhymes and songs. And the baby emerges even sounding already a bit like a member of that community. So I'll close with one more really interesting study that has implications for how we might treat premature babies. You know, if you think about it, preemies who are born weeks or even months early, they're missing out on some of this very important learning that goes on in the last weeks of pregnancy. When a baby's born too early, for example, that baby is no longer hearing her mother's voice on a more or less continual basis. You know, for their own safety, for their own care, they're kept in incubators, in a NICU, in a neonatal intensive care unit. They're in a completely different environment from the one that a full-term baby would be in the womb. And that may have implications for preemie's brain development, because that fetal learning that goes on at the end of pregnancy is so crucial. So scientists at Harvard Medical School recently started exploring these issues. This is really cutting-edge stuff. By running this experiment, they took a group of premature babies who were born at 25 to 32 weeks. Now, if you think about that, if they were full-term babies, they would still have had another 8 to 15 weeks in the womb. That's a long time. Half of these babies in the experiment heard just the usual noises of the NICU, of the hospital, you know, the beeps and the nurses moving around, but nothing like what they would hear in the womb. The other half of this group of premature babies heard recordings that their mothers made of their voices and of their heartbeats. A few months later, the brains of all the babies were scanned using ultrasound. And the brains of the babies that heard their mother's voices through this recording that was kind of piped into their incubator, the part of the brain that is associated with hearing and interpreting sounds, the auditory cortex, was bigger in those premature babies who'd heard recordings of their mother's voices. So just by talking, just by carrying out her daily life, the pregnant woman is helping her baby's brain to grow, which I think is an amazing and a much more hopeful message than the ones that pregnant women often get, which is, you know, be careful, don't do the wrong thing, you'll hurt your baby. You know, actually, just by being yourself, you're giving your baby everything it needs to grow and to develop into a healthy infant. So this, I think, pretty ingenious experiment by these Harvard Medical School professors suggests that premature babies should be allowed to visit with their parents as much as possible, and maybe also that they should be hearing recordings of their mother's voice and heartbeat, since that seems to aid their brain development. But this research also carries a bigger lesson, one that, again, I find personally really relevant and meaningful. And that's that we're caring for our babies, we're helping them grow, we're initiating them into our cultures and into our communities, that we're making them one of us long before they're ever born. Thank you so much for listening to me this morning.
We wanted to spend a few minutes just asking Annie some questions, really birthed out of her own book, and so I think we got a table, and we wanted to spend a few minutes just while we had a Yale professor / expert on learning. We thought, since we're a learning institution, we'd spend a few minutes asking you some questions. Right off the bat, Annie, again, thank you so much. But obviously, by the time we get our typical students showing up here at Liberty, you know, you're talking about the first 9 months of development being actually in the mama's belly, and then you know, a one-day-old baby really being a 9-month-old learner. But we got 19-year-olds walking in the room.
It's too late for them.
It's too late for them. Yeah. There you go. They've already been pickled into their beliefs and into their. So yeah, what advice would you give us? I mean, obviously, it's good to know that. I think for us as believers, we listen to that and we look at it through the lens of God creating people in His image in the belly of a mama, but then we also listen to it in that we see the value of ministering to moms who are going through traumatic experiences, even in our own city and through the world. We see it as opportunities for us to step into the life of those who need help 2 months into their pregnancy, need help 3 months into their pregnancy. But take us a little bit further out. Like, so you're an expert on learning. What advice would you give us on learning as 19-year-olds, as 20-year-olds? As, some practical advice, like, is coffee good? I mean, am I supposed to wake up and drink 2 cups of Starbucks before 9 a.m., or is that bad?
Coffee's necessary, yeah.
Necessary, there you go.
Yeah. But,
yeah, give us some advice.
I would say, the thing that is really important in learning at any age is engagement, which is really putting yourself into what you're learning. And often, too often that doesn't happen in our schools, and not here, I'm sure, but in some of our institutions of higher learning. And so I think one reason that happens is that education is so often presented as, here are the answers, memorize them, parrot them back on a test. No one's ever been very interested in an answer. What's interesting are questions, So if you can find questions that are interesting to you, if your teachers can sort of start with the question rather than the answer. There's a really wonderful book called What the Best College Students Do, written by this guy named Ken Bain, who has started teaching and learning centers at universities all over the country and has spent many years studying what it is that makes for a successful, a meaningful, and a profound kind of college experience. And he found that the people who'd had that kind of experience in college were those who had a kind of driving question. And the questions are different for every person, but a driving question that they really wanted to have the answer to. And that guided and shaped and structured their studies and gave it all a kind of meaning and coherence. So I would ask students here to think for a moment, what's the question that you want to answer? What's the question that you're driven to find answers to? And that brings about engagement. And engagement, when we're engaged, we try harder, we persevere longer, our minds actually think better. So you end up actually, doing better in school, which matters too. But it's all because you're fully in it and with it. And that's, I think, what we all want from our education.
It's really great. I was reading an article that you wrote for, I think, TimeMagazine.com, about how a morning routine can actually be a hindrance more than just a help. It can be more of a roadblock than a stepping stone in the life of someone being able to achieve better days. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, because a lot of us wake up and we kind of have this college, like we sign up for Tuesday, Thursday classes, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So we're definitely falling into a bit of a rhythm.
Right.
But at the same time, we're here at a learning institution.
Yes.
Give us some of your research on that.
Yes.
Just for all of us who wake up every day and know we have an 8 o'clock, that's on the clock. We're really, actually, by the way, like, we're moving the schedule where you guys are going to get to have your first class at 8 o'clock instead of earlier. I don't know if you knew that, but giving them a little more time to sleep. But that said, give us some more thoughts on, like, really the rhythm maybe being an enemy more than a friend to the process of learning.
Yeah. Well, the article that David's referring to is looking specifically at creativity and how a lot of our morning routines actually work against creativity. And then we kind of get into work or into a class, and we're supposed to think in these innovative, open-minded ways. And everything we've done up to that point is kind of pushing against that. So I tried to, in this article, kind of reimagine what a morning routine might look like that was actually that would actually foster creativity and innovative thinking. And One thing might be taking a little extra time when you wake up, if you're not already late for your morning class, to kind of lie there while you're still a little bit drowsy. You know, interestingly, there's different kinds of attention. There's the very focused kind of attention that we pay to, you know, a textbook, for example. And then there's a more diffuse kind of attention where unexpected connections can be made. And surprisingly, that we're more likely to be in that more diffuse mode when we're actually a little bit tired or a little bit drunk, but I'm sure that never happens, right? And
we have this drunk in the Holy Spirit thing, but
right.
We can ask you that next time we go.
Think of Hemingway, you know, writing and drinking, but the idea is that when you're a little bit, you're still in that dreamy kind of sleepy mode. Thoughts come to you that wouldn't in your come on, let's get things done way. And similarly, you could take a little extra time in the shower. You know, a lot of us get our best ideas in the shower, and that's no coincidence. It's because we have that downtime, and you know, I hope nobody ever invents like a waterproof iPad or iPhone, because we don't have downtime anymore when we have access to our devices, you know, and that's actually probably doing harm to our creative and innovative thinking, because we never have to be bored, we never have to have a down moment, we never have to kind of just let our mind wander, because there's always that source of stimulation that's right there. And it's good to tear yourself away from that and let yourself not really do or think anything for a little while. And that's when those unexpected connections get made.
So most of us just wake up and reach for our phone,
right,
which is an instant source of news, whether it's personal news on a text or it's a little bit more, you know, local or national or whatever. Right. But your research is showing that can actually be a hindrance, right? Starting the day with even turning on the TV and just letting news come in.
Right.
A little bit about that.
Yeah, the brain has what's called a default network, which is where we go, the mode that we shift into when we're not thinking about anything specific. And what's one really interesting thing about the default network is that it seems to be especially primed to think about the social aspects of our life. You know, if you do have that downtime when you're driving or you're in the shower, you might find yourself thinking about a conversation that you had, or a relationship with a friend that's a little troubled, or, you know, conversation you had with a parent. And that seems to be because, you know, we humans are such a social species, and our social relationships are so important that the default network actually seems to be set up to automatically steer us back to relationships and to think them over, to mull them over, to work on them. But if we go right away to the news or to Facebook or whatever, we're not giving our minds the chance to do that.
Wow. So what do you recommend? Like if we were going to log on to something or whatever, is there something that your research has shown is actually helps us, is productive? And yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing is to actually build in time in your day for daydreaming. You know, to deliberately make sure that you have some time when you're not focused in such a fine-grained way, you know.
They have time for that at Yale, but we're at Liberty. We don't have a lot of time for daydreaming. Maybe at Yale, but
right. And the other thing I would say, David, if I could just give a plea to all you. Are you millennials? Are you in that group that's known as millennials? You're young people who grew up with all this technology, and you think that you can multitask. You know, all young people think that their brains are wired differently and they can multitask. You can't. You can't. So it's fine, you know, if you're watching TV and you want to text your friend about, you know, I mean, there's a time when multitasking is fine. But when you're studying, when you're writing, when you're really trying to absorb material in a really deep way, monotask. Just do that one thing. That's probably the best advice I can give for being productive. And it's one that it's hard to follow, I know.
On that thought, I read an article you did, I think it was either for Time Magazine or CNN.com, about listening to music while you're doing your homework or while you're doing something else. Give us a few thoughts on that. That probably won't be a big surprise, but based off of what you just said. But would love, again, you're the expert on thinking here. We'd just love some of your thoughts. Does that actually invigorate? I've heard sometimes people say, if I'm involved in one level of thinking where I'm opening up one bracket, you know, of investment, as far as thinking is concerned, it only actually opens it up for the other. So is that true, or is it better just to focus, or?
It's better to focus. I mean, the thing is that we have limited processing power. Our brains have limited processing power. If we're listening to music, our brain has no choice but to interpret that. If it's music that has words, our brain has no choice. It's kind of obligatory to decode those words and be processing that language. That's just the way our brains work. But then that means that there's proportionately less brain power left over for the, in a way, very similar language-related tasks that we're working on. So classical music, actually, if you're going to listen to, what's the word for music that doesn't have, instrumental music. It doesn't have to be classical, but instrumental music that doesn't have words is the way to go if you want to listen to music while you work.
Yeah, that's good. I think our generation, and I know I'm not from their generation, I'm older, but we really have a hard time with silence a lot of times. We feel like silence is awkward, and we just want to multitask a lot of times just to fill all the margin. But you're saying that there's just great value in focus and great value in actually the value of silence, right? That negative space where
that absence of stimulation, where the quieter things that go on in your mind can come to the fore. Yeah, because so much of our lives is so noisy and so full of stimulation that quieter stuff in the mind can get lost.
It's fascinating. Hey, can we just thank you again?
Thank you.
Paul, great job today.
Thank you.
Thank you.